The moon, bisexual. It was the most ancient worship of all, that of the third race of our round, the Hermaphrodites, to whom the male moon became sacred, when after the, quote, fall, end quote, so-called, the sexes had become separated. Quote, DEUS LUNUS, end quote, then became an androgyne, male and female in turn, to serve finally for purposes of sorcery, as a dual power to the fourth root race, the Atlanteans. With the fifth race, our own, the lunar solar worship divided the nations into two distinct antagonistic camps. It led to events described aeons later in the Mahabharatan War, which to the Europeans is the fabulous, to the Hindus and the occultists the historical, strife between the Sarvanasas and the Indivanasas. Originating in the dual aspect of the moon, the worship of the female and the male principles respectively, it ended in distinct solar and lunar cults. Among the Semitic races, the sun was for a very long time feminine and the moon was masculine, the later notion being adopted by them from the Atlantean traditions. The moon was called, quote, the Lord of the Sun, end quote, Bel Shemesh, before the Shemesh worship. The ignorance of the incipient reasons for such a distinction and of occult principles led the nations into anthropomorphic idol worship. Though the Jewish canon and Christianism have made the sun become the, quote, Lord God, end quote, and Jehovah in the Bible, yet the latter is full of indiscreet traces of the androgyne deity, which was Jehovah the sun, and Astaroth the moon in its female aspects, and quite free from the present metaphorical element that's been given to it. God is a, quote, consuming fire, end quote, appears in and is accomplished by fire, end quote. It was not only in vision that in Ezekiel 8:16 saw the Jews, quote, worshipping the sun, end quote. The Baal of Israelites, Shemesh of the Moabites, and Moloch of the Ammonites was the identical, quote, Son Jehovah, end quote. And he is till now, quote, the king of the host of heavens, end quote. The sun, as much as Astaroth was the, quote, queen of heaven, end quote, or the moon. The, quote, son of righteousness, end quote, has become a metaphorical expression only now. But the religion of every ancient nation had primarily been based upon the occult manifestations of a purely abstract force or principle, now just called, quote, God, end quote. The very establishment of such worship shows, in its details and its rites, that the philosophers who evolved these systems of nature, subjective and objective, possessed profound knowledge, and they were acquainted with many facts of a scientific nature. For besides being purely occult, the rites of lunar worship were based, as just shown, upon a knowledge of physiology, quite a modern science with us, psychology, sacred mathematics, geometry, and metrology, and their right applications to symbols and figures, which are but glyphs recording observed natural and scientific facts. In short, upon a most minute and profound knowledge of nature, lunar magnetism generates life, preserves it, as well as kills it. Soma embodies the triple power of Trimurti, though it passes unrecognized by the profane to this day. The allegory that makes Soma, the moon, produced by the churning of the ocean of life, or space, by the gods in another Manvantara, progenic day of our planetary system, and that the other allegory which shows, quote, the rishis milking the earth, whose calf was Soma, the moon, end quote, has a deep cosmographical meaning, for it is neither our earth which is milked, nor was the moon, which we know was the calf. Had our wise men of science known as much of the mysteries of nature as the ancient Aryans did, they would surely never have imagined that the moon was projected from the earth. Once more, the oldest of permeations in theogony, the Son becoming his own Father, and the Mother generated by the Son, it has to be remembered and taken into consideration if the symbolical language of the ancients is to be understood by us. Otherwise, mythology will be ever haunting to the Orientalists as simply, quote, the disease which springs up at a peculiar stage of human culture, end quote. The ancients taught the, so to speak, auto-generation of the gods, the one divine essence unmanifested, perpetually begetting a second self, manifested, which second self, androgynous in its nature, gives birth in an immaculate way to everything macro and microcosmical in this universe. Thus was shown by the circle and the diameter of the sacred number 10. But our Orientalists, their extreme desire to discover one homogeneous element in nature notwithstanding, will not see it. Cramped in their researches by such ignorance, they, the Arianists and the Egyptologists, are constantly led astray from the truth in their own speculations. Thus, DEUS is unable to understand, in the text in which he translates the meaning of Amun-Ra, saying to King Amenophes, which is supposed to be King Memnon, quote, "Thou art my son, I have begotten thee," end quote, and as he finds the same idea in many a text and under many a forms. This very Christian Orientalist is finally compelled to exclaim that, quote, "For this idea to have entered the mind of a hierogrammatist, there must have been in their religion a more or less defined doctrine, indicating as a possible fact that one might come to pass a divine and immaculate incarnation under a human form," end quote. Precisely so, but why throw the explanation on an impossible prophecy when the whole secret is explained by the latter religion copying the earlier? That doctrine was universal, and it was not the mind of any one hierogrammatist that evolved it, for the Indian avatars are a proof to the contrary. After which, having come to, quote, realize clearer, end quote, what the, quote, divine Father and Son, end quote, were with the Egyptians, DEUS still fails to account for and perceive what were the functions attributed to the feminine principle in that primordial generation. Footnote: this clearer realization of it, that the Egyptians prophesied Jehovah and his incarnated Redeemer, the good serpent, etc., etc., even to identifying Typhon with the wicked dragon in the Garden of Eden, and this passes as serious and sober science. End of footnote. But it is found now that the planets, the elements, and the zodiac were figured not only in Heliopolis by the 12 stones called, quote, mysteries. How much more grandiose, philosophical, and poetical is the real distinction, for whoever is able to understand and appreciate it, made between the Immaculate Virgin of the ancient pagans and the modern papal conception. With the former, the ever-youthful Mother Nature, the antitype of her prototypes, the sun and the moon, generates and brings forth her, quote, mind-born, end quote, son, which is the universe. The sun and the moon, as male-female deities, fructify the earth, the microcosmical mother, and the latter conceives and brings forth in her turn. With the Christians, quote, the firstborn, end quote, primogenitus, is indeed generated, i.e. begotten, quote, genitum non factum, end quote, and positively conceived and brought forth. Quote, Virgo pariah, end quote, explains the Latin Church. Thus, she drags down the noble spiritual idea of the Virgin Mary to the earth, and making her, quote, of the earth earthly, end quote, and degrades that ideal to the lowest of the anthropomorphic goddesses of the rabble. Truly, Neith, Isis, Diana, etc., were each of them, quote, a demiurgical goddess, at once visible and invisible, having her place in heaven and helping the generation of species, end quote. Basically, the moon, in short. Her occult aspects and powers are numberless, and in one of them, the moon becomes with the Egyptians Hathor, another aspect of Isis, and both of these goddesses are shown suckling Horus. Behold, in the Egyptian Hall of the British Museum, Hathor worshipped by Pharaoh Thutmose, who stands between her and the Lord of Heavens. Footnote: Hathor is the infernal Isis, the goddess preeminently of the West, or the netherworld. The monolith was taken from Karnak, and the same goddess has the following legend inscribed on her throne, quote, all caps, the divine mother and lady, or queen of heaven, end quote, and then also, quote, all caps, the morning star, end quote, and the all caps, quote, light of the sea, end quote, Stella Mutina and Lux Marcis. All of the lunar goddesses had a dual aspect, one divine and the other infernal. All were the virgin mothers of an immaculately born son, S-O-N, or the S-U-N. Raoul Rachetti shows the moon goddess of the Athenians, Pallas or Cybele, Minerva, or again Diana, holding her child's son on the lap, invoked in her festivals as Monogenes Theou, quote, the one mother of God, end quote, sitting on a lion and surrounded by 12 personages, in whom the occultist recognizes the 12 great gods, and the pious Christian Orientalist the apostles, or rather, the Grecian pagan prophecy thereof. They are both right, for the Immaculate goddesses of the Latin Church is a faithful copy of the older pagan goddesses. The number 12 of the apostles is that of the 12 tribes, and the latter are the personification of the 12 great gods and the 12 signs of the zodiac. Every detail, almost in Christian dogma, is borrowed from the heathens. Semele, the wife of Jupiter and mother of Bacchus, the sun, is according to Nonus also, quote, carried, end quote, or made to ascend to heaven after her death, where she presides between Mars and Venus, under the name of the Queen of the World, or the Universe, quote, at the names of which, as at the names of Hathor, Hecate, and all other fertile goddesses, end quote, quote, tremble all the demons, end quote, quote, Simelin premusi daemones, end quote. This Greek inscription on a small temple, reproduced on a stone that was found by somebody, and copied by Montfaucon, as de Merville tells us, informs us the stupendous fact that the magna mater, or mater, of Old World was an imprudent plagiarism, perpetrated by the demon of the Immaculate Virgin Mother of his church. Whether so, or vice versa, is of no importance. That which is interesting to note is the perfect identity between the archaic copy and the modern original. Did space permit, we might show the inconceivable coolness and unconcern exhibited by certain followers of the Roman Catholic Church when made to face the revelations of the past. Chumari's remark that the, quote, virgin took possession of all the sanctuaries of Ceres and good measure transferred to the mother of Christ, end quote. The Advocate of Rome answers in the following, quote, that such is the fact, and that it is just as it should be, and quite natural, as the dogma, the liturgy, and the rites professed by the Roman Apostolic Church in 1862 are found engraved on monuments, inscribed on papyri, and cylinders hardly posterior to the deluge. It does seem impossible to deny the existence of a first anti-historical or Roman Catholicism, of which our own is but the faithful continuation. But while the former was the culmination, the summum of the impudence of demons and goetic necromancy, the latter is divine. If in our Christian revelation, the Apocalypse, Mary, clothed with the sun and having the moon under her feet, has nothing more in common with the humble servant of Nazareth, it is because she has now become the greatest of the theological and cosmological powers in our universe. End quote. Verily so, since Pindar's hymn to Minerva, page 19, states, quote, who sits at the right hand of her father, Jupiter, and who is more powerful than all the other angels or gods, end quote, are likewise applied to the Virgin. It is Saint Bernard who is made to address the Virgin Mary in this wise, following, quote, the Son Christ lives in thee, and thou livest in him, end quote. See the Sermon on the Holy Virgin. Again, the Virgin is admitted to be the moon by the same unsophisticated holy man, being the Lucina of the Church, that is, in childbirth, the Verge of Vigil, quote, Casta fova Lucina, tues jam regnat Apollo, end quote, is applied to her. Like the moon, the Virgin is the Queen of Heaven, end quote, adds the innocent saint. This settles the question. The more similarity, according to such writers as de Merville, there exists between the pagan conceptions of the Christian dogmas, the more divine appears the Christian religion, and the more it is seen to be the only true inspired one, and especially in its Roman Catholic forms. The unbelieving scientists and the academians who think that they see in the Latin Church quite the opposite of divine inspiration, and who will not believe in the satanic tricks of plagiarism by anticipation, are severely taken to task. But then, quote, they believe in nothing and reject even the, quote, Nabatean agriculture, end quote, as a romance and as a pack of superstitious nonsense, end quote, complains the memorialist. Quote, in their perverted opinion, Crutame's idol of the moon and the statue of the Madonna are one, end quote. A noble marquis wrote 20 years ago, reader's note, 160 years ago currently, end reader's note, 20 years ago, 6 huge volumes, or as he calls them, quote, memoirs to the French Academy, end quote, with the sole object of showing Roman Catholicism an inspired and revealed faith. As a proof thereof, he furnishes numerous facts, all tending to show that the entire ancient world, ever since the deluge, had been, with the help of the devil, systematically plagiarizing the rites, ceremonies, and dogmas of the future Holy Church to be born ages later. What would that faithful son of Rome have said had he heard from his co-religionist, M. Renoir, the distinguished Egyptologist of the British Museum, declaring in one of his learned lectures that, quote, neither Hebrews nor Greeks borrowed any of their ideas from Egypt, end quote, quoted from Mr. Gerald Massey's lecture. But perhaps it is just this that Mr. M. Renoir intended to say, namely, that it is the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Aryans who borrowed theirs from the Latin Church? And if so, why in the name of logic do the papists reject the additional information which the occultist may give them on moon worship, since it all tends to show their Roman Catholic worship as old as the world of Sabianism and astrology? And the reason of the early Christian and the later Roman Catholics astrology, or symbolical worship of sun and moon, identical with that of the Gnostics, though less philosophical and pure than the, quote, sun worship, end quote, of the Zoroastrians, is a natural consequence of its birth and origin. The adoption by the Latin Church of such symbols as water, fire, sun, moon, and stars, and a good many of the other things, is simply a continuation by the early Christians of the old worship of pagan nations. Thus Odin got his wisdom, power, and knowledge by sitting at the feet of Mimir, the thrice-wise Jotun, who passed his life by the fountain of the primeval wisdom, the crystalline waters of which increased his knowledge daily. Mimir, quote, drew the highest knowledge from the fountain because the world was born of water. Hence, primeval wisdom was to be found in that mysterious element, end quote. See Asgard and the Gods, page 86. The eye which Odin had to pledge to acquire that knowledge may be, quote, the sun which enlightens and penetrates all things. His other eye being the moon, whose reflection gazes out of the deep, and which at last, when setting, sinks into the ocean, end quote. But it is something more. Besides this, Loki, the fire god, is said to have hidden in the water as well as in the moon, the light giver, whose reflection he found therein, and this belief that the fire finds refuge in the water was not limited just to the old Scandinavians. It was shared by all nations, and was finally taken up by the early Christians who symbolized Holy Ghost under the shape of fire, quote, cloven tongues like as fire, end quote, the breath of the Father, or, in all caps, the Son, S-U-N. This, quote, fire, end quote, descends also into the water or into the sea, Mar, Mer, Mary. The dove was the symbol of the soul with several different nations. It was sacred to Venus, the goddess born from the sea foam, and it became later the symbol of the Christian Anima Mundi, or of the Holy Spirit. Of typology. One of the most occult chapters in the, quote, Book of the Dead, end quote, is entitled, quote, to make the transformation into the God-giving light to the path of darkness, end quote, wherein, quote, woman light of the shadow, end quote, serves Thoth in his retreat in the moon. Thoth Hermes is said to hide therein because he is a representative of that secret wisdom. He is the manifested logos of its light side, the concealed deity, or, quote, dark wisdom, end quote, when he is supposed to retire to the opposite hemisphere. Speaking of her power, the moon calls herself repeatedly, quote, the light which shineth in darkness, end quote, the woman light. Hence, it became the accepted symbol of all the Virgin Mother goddesses. As the wicked, quote, evil, end quote, spirits warred against the moon in the days of yore, so they are supposed to war now, without being able to prevail, however, against the actual Queen of Heaven, Mary, the moon. Hence also the moon was intimately connected in all the pagan theogonies with the dragon, her eternal enemy, the Virgin or Madonna, standing on the mythical Satan under that form, crushed and powerless under her feet. This because the head and the tail of the dragon, which represent in Eastern astronomy to this day the ascending and descending nodes of the moon, were also symbolized in ancient Greece by the two serpents. Hercules kills them on the day of his birth, and so does the babe in his Virgin Mother's arms. As Mr. Gerald Massey aptly observes in this connection, quote, all such symbols figured their own facts from the first, and did not prefigure others of a totally different order. The iconography, and the dogmas too, had survived in Rome from a period remotely pre-Christian. There was neither forgery nor interpolation of types, nothing but a continuity of the imagery and the perversion of its meaning." End quote. We continue in the next video of this series of Symbology of World Religions with the tree, the serpent, and crocodile worship. Until the next time, love yourselves and love each other unconditionally.